All right, let's take a second or two or three and talk about ways that we can go from 3D information back to 2D information so that you can use it for making drawings or models or all sorts of other stuff. Okay, so first I'll give you a tour of this thing. This is the blowtorch that I made for this assignment, and I'm going to go quickly look at the guts. All right, so take clipping plane. All right, cool. Doesn't really matter how big that thing is, it just needs a direction. So you can see the inside of it here. I've got some voids. Here's the whatever, the butane or whatever is in this torch. You can see I've got some void spaces inside my valve here. I've got a void space inside this pipe. So I've got a good mix of solids and voids in this thing. It's a pretty tidy model, so it should be pretty easy. Just so you know what the inside of this thing looks like, so you'll be able to contextualize some of the geometry that I pull out of it. So, okay, first, easiest probably go-to way to translate stuff from 3D to 2D is a command called make2D, which is basically short for make a 2D drawing. One thing you do want to be aware of is what you're trying to show with your drawing that you're making. So in the case of doing something like a technical drawing or an axonometric drawing or a measured drawing, click on the somewhere in the gray space of the viewport, check the properties, make sure that you're in parallel projection. You don't want perspective. You're going to get like a vanishing point in here. It's not super obvious because I got my lens length at like 50 over here, but if I switch to something like 35, I'm going to see a little bit more perspective distortion. So if you're trying to achieve something like a realistic photo or a rendered view of what a building looks like from the human eye perspective, this is a great tool because it makes it accurately or realistically represents it in the way that we see it, but it's not what you want for a measured drawing because this gets, it's not accurate because it changes size as it gets further away from the quote-unquote camera. So make sure that we're in parallel projection when we make these drawings. All right, cool. So to make a drawing really easily, select this stuff, make 2D. You'll see a bunch of different options. You can select it to just show the lines that you see. You can also tell it to show the hidden lines inside that aren't shown. For the purposes of this, I'll do both. So if I make this drawing, then what it's going to do is it's going to make a two-dimensional drawing and it's going to dump it on the top plane of my Rhino model. By default, you can change that. So you can see that's just a flat drawing of this thing that I can then edit like any other 2D line work. If I were to go back to this model, run that command again, and tell it to show hidden lines also, then it's also going to show me a little bit of the guts here. And if I made a nice tidy model, then it's going to look good. Now you can see here, I've got a little bit of a problem because I wanted to make the same drawing twice, but because my camera was in two different spots, then it didn't do a super good job. It did a perfectly fine job, but I just didn't set it up for success. So let's delete this stuff and really quickly take a second and set us up a view so that we can make sure that both of those things are done from the same angle. So let's say I don't know, this looks like a good angle to me. You can always go to View and we may have already seen this at this point in the semester, but we can go to Set View, Name Views, and I'll call this something like axon. And that way, if I want to make the same drawing twice like I just did, I can just recall this view and it will snap me right back to that same, the same camera location. So check it out. There we go. Okay, let's talk about sections real quick. So we know from our little tour with the clipping plane, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in here. I don't exactly remember along the vertical axis where that happens, but I do remember that right down the middle, there's some good stuff. So let's start with the obvious. So I'm going to go to the top, whoop, section, right, cool, couldn't spell, sorry. And let's say, start there, hold down Shift to make a nice straight line, and say, yeah, it looks good. You'll notice I had an option on over here or up here if you're on a PC where I had the option to group it. That's really handy because if I accidentally unselect it, I can easily grab all that stuff that I just made and select it all at one time. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to move it out of the way, and maybe I'll give it its own layer, and I'm just going to kind of say vertical section, and I'll put this on that layer, open the Properties tab, and dump him right there. And maybe what I'm going to go ahead and do is just like turn that guy off. And I'll make a new layer for some horizontal sections to keep everything organized. So horizontal sections, and make that my current layer. And now let's go find where to cut some horizontal sections. And I'll look at that maybe from the front. And you can see my view changed. That's really handy because if I am in the same shaded view, I don't really remember where along this axis useful things or interesting things happened or geometries changed on the inside. But if I go into this ghosted view, then I can figure it out real quick, and I can use my section command to select all this stuff. Say I want to cut a section through all of this. Yeah, there we go. Cool. And then I can start cutting my sections. Again, I'll hold down Shift to draw some nice straight lines, and I'm going to do this wherever the geometry kind of changes. Now it's up to you to decide what's important and what's not. If you're trying to capture the essence of this object, I'm just going to do it in lots of places. Maybe I'll do it again. Where's this little guy? Right, yeah, right through the middle of that pin. It's a good spot. And maybe, and I could do one kind of this way, but it bugs me when I don't get the section line exactly right. So I could draw myself some reference geometry to snap to, or maybe I'm just going to commit to doing these all this way. How you represent your stuff is up to you. Again, do what feels right based on your objects. That to me, I don't really like it, but it's just a tutorial. So if I were turning in for a grade, I would probably do it at a section perpendicular to this. But no matter, let's go back to this view, and we can see all that stuff that we just made is still in the original place on the object. I could move it all this way, but you know what I might want to do is undo that move, copy all this stuff and paste it, and just leave a copy of all that stuff where it originally was. And you can kind of see where all those things were on the object. And this is really handy if I ever want to kind of, use this as a sort of section line to indicate where those sections were cut. This is really a nice way to do it. So again, if I wanted to combine this with another drawing where I was going to go link back to this, that's handy. Okay, cool. Now all this stuff is floating in space. It looks pretty cool, but it's not super useful that way. If I wanted to lay these out flat on a board, then that gets pretty easy. And let's take a look at different ways of manipulating these things using the different commands that we can reorient these with. All right, so maybe I want to lay all these out and start arranging them on the top plane. So if I look at this kind of a zoom out, this kind of imaginary plane in space, that's the top plane. Now that's actually what's called the control plane. You can move this in all sorts of different directions, but right now I'm just going to, that's the XY plane. Let's just use that to draw on. So if I look at this from the top plane, I can see all that stuff that I grabbed using the section command is still just in a big stack like it was in the original object. And I can't really see it very well from this way. So I could go do something like move. Honestly, the easiest way, you just have this many. There aren't that many. So what I'm going to do quickly is I'm just going to grab maybe that whole stack and move them over, and then I'm going to use command to unselect the bottom thing on the stack, and then I'm going to move them over, and then I'm going to, oh, sorry, I meant to keep that one selected and then unselect this. So this way, as I move all this stuff over, I can count on it not overlapping when I look at it from the top, right? So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm kind of separating all this stuff so it doesn't just crash into each other, or into it just doesn't all crash when you're looking at it from the top viewport. So I can spread them all out and look at them individually. Now, if I had like a million billion drawings, like if I use the contour command to slice this thing a whole bunch of times, then the other thing that I could do is select all this stuff and use a command called shear and select an origin point, maybe somewhere down there. And you have to then switch to like a front or a right view, one of these orthographic views. And then I'm just going to and this will allow me to kind of spread this stuff out a little bit. And you want to do it so that none of the stuff overlaps. So you can see some of these guys are still overlapping. It is a command that's a little bit tedious. I don't really like it, but it can be really useful sometimes if the stuff is really close together. Here, where our curves are really far apart, I don't really like it very much, so I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way, which could be like this. But actually, it doesn't have to be, because the other thing that I can do is to simply select this, and maybe I want to move this over like kind of a lot. And then what I can do is select that whole bunch of stuff, and I can say distribute. And it's going to ask me which axis it wants to distribute on. And if I look down there, maybe I want to lay these all out along a line that way, which down here, according to my little coordinate thinger, it's the x direction. So I'm going to say distribute x, and that will space them all evenly out in the x direction. So still not awesome, but really a lot better, because if I look at it now from the top view, that looks really pretty darn nice. So if I wanted to do something like, maybe be a little bit more careful, or simply move these guys back a little bit closer together, then I could just redo that same command, and I could just be a little more careful with the way that I did it. So maybe go to the top, and that was this guy over here. Distribute along the x-axis again. And ooh, I got lucky there because none of that stuff crashes. Cool. That's probably a little bit too close. Maybe what I want to do is do that one more time and just let that stuff breathe a little bit. So let's repeat that last command. X. That looks pretty good. Cool. So in this view, it looks really nice. In the axon view, it's kind of like, oh man. Okay, so then what I want to do is I want to lay this all nice and flat. That's really, really easy. I go up to the top view and then select all this stuff, and I say ProjectToCplane. That's going to project it to the control plane that we just talked about. You can delete the original objects, or you can just leave them. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and say delete this original stuff. So you don't see any change in this view, but if I look here on the axon, now this stuff has all been projected to the XY plane, and that's given us a nice little arrangement. Now, if I want to have this guy laid out next to it, that could be really easy. I could just use the gumball to rotate this 90 degrees, and then rotate it again, and then use that ProjectToCplane command to flatten it out again. Sometimes it's not always that easy, because maybe you cut a super weird section, or you just like cut it at a cool angle and you ended up with something that was like this, and it's not super clear how you need to rotate it to get it to lie flat on this plane. That's a really great place for another command called orient 3 points. To do that, I'm going to make myself a little reference object, because I don't have anything that's really easy to snap onto in this drawing, because everything is round. So what I'm going to do now is, if I want this crooked drawing to lay flat on this surface down here, then I can use this and say orient 3 points. And I'm going to give it some reference points. Now I know that this section is like, it's a planar kind of collection of curves. So maybe my first reference will be that corner, my second reference will be that corner, and my third reference will be this thing here. And now I need to snap it to some new reference points that are planar relative to the ground, which in this case might be this guy and this guy and this guy. And it's not going to resize it. I can have it scale it to the original things, but I don't need to in this case. So now it's flat on the ground, and if I look at it in the top view, I can easily just use the gumball if I need to, if I didn't get this exactly right. And now I can go down here and I can squeeze it right up next to my other drawings. And if I want it to align exactly, then I can kind of try to eyeball it, or I can use my align command and say align on the left side of this thing, point to the bottom of this. And now it's nice and tidy. So this stuff is really helpful if you're making things like, well, if you're trying to make things from other shapes in your drawing, or if you're trying to make an actual drawing, or if you're trying to make a model and you need to make cut files for a laser cutter or a Just you can even just print them out and cut them out with an X-Acto knife or whatever. But if you're trying to make that kind of stuff, this is really, really, really helpful for making two-dimensional drawings. Another thing that's really cool is it goes beyond the simple utility of representing three-dimensional objects in two-dimensional things. It can also convert three-dimensional objects into two-dimensional geometries. Now, here's what I mean. So this stuff is all pretty straightforward. You can kind of imagine with your head how to make these things using in the same way that you would with a pencil and paper. Now, one thing that's really cool, though, is if I wanted to, let's go ahead and turn off some of this stuff. Just let's go ahead and make this the current layer. Off. Cool. Let's say I wanted to make a model of this thing, right? And I wanted to make it not by laser cutting, slices of this cylinder, but I wanted to roll this cylinder, and I needed to know how big of a piece of paper that I needed to, cut out so I can roll it up. I could measure this and get the circumference and say it's the circumference times the height, which is, with a cylinder is super easy. But I can also do something in Rhino that's really cool, and I can use it to just make that file for me. And that's called UnrollSrf. This guy right here. And it's going to ask me to select a surface I want to unroll. I'm going to say unroll this guy, except for not all that, because that's going to be a mess. So let's go ahead and redo that command, and I'm just going to do a Control-Shift and say, hey, this surface here, unroll this guy. No? All right, maybe what I need to do first is Control-Shift, Control-Shift, and I extract this surface from it, which I can do using whoa, just kidding. There we go. So if I take these guys and I say unroll surface, then it will let me select these guys because they're just individual surfaces and not poly surfaces, right? So if I do this, what this is going to do is it's going to unroll that surface for me and tell me how to make them, right? So this surface down here is this surface up here. Now I selected an option to label all this stuff, and the reason that's helpful is because it tells me that this edge here, 0, aligns to this edge here, 1 is that edge, and 2 is that edge. Now for a cylinder, I mean, you can just do the math like we talked about. Where this gets more helpful here is if I take this guy, let's go ahead and let's grab a couple of these things here. Now I don't want to ruin my original model, so I'm just going to copy this and paste this and move it over here. And then I'm just going to explode this thing. And that makes it break this, that breaks this all into individual surfaces. So cool, now that's a surface, that's a surface, that's a surface. I'm gonna do the same thing over here. I'm making a mess of this model, guys, so don't do this on your original one. Make a copy of all this stuff, but this is just for this demo. Okay, cool. Check this out. If I do something like this thing, that's gonna be hard to figure out how to make. This thing is going to be hard to figure out how to make, except Rhino will help me figure it out too. Because if I take this guy and I say unroll surface, and I say, okay, done, then what that's going to do is see it made, no, get out of the way over here. You two, get out of here. Cool, so here's what it did. It made this thing flat on this. So if I wanted to know what shape I need to cut out of a piece of paper, or laser cut in order to be able to roll it into a cone like this, this gives me a clue for what I need. This tells me exactly what it is actually. So, another shape that's really hard to, that's not obvious how to make is something like this. So unroll surface, okie dokes, check this out. There's that thing again. Now it kind of dumps these things in the same spot every time, so you might need to move them. But this guy is that cone unrolled and flattened. So if you need to know how to cut this piece of paper out with a laser cutter or with a X-Acto knife or whatever to roll it into that shape, that will do it. Now this will only work with surfaces that are have what's called single curvature. So things like a sphere, it's not going to do that with, because you can't just like unroll a sphere. But anything like a cone or a cylinder or a long ribbony thing, this will give you the shape that you need to have to make that. So like a shape like this. Or there we go. So if I explode this guy, surface. So this is going to even give me, let's see here, where is that thing? There we go. This even gives me the cutout that I had when I needed to make that shape that went around whoosh, that dial.